It's about 10:02. We'll get started here. We've got a great crowd on. I'm sure we'll get more people on. And I am going to record this so that if we want to be able to take a look at it later on or send it out to a bunch of people who contacted me this morning, I'll definitely do that. So welcome. And this is just to take a half hour. That's my goal. To we go from 10 to 10:30 today, and to give you an overview of the CIAC transfer rule. Definitely something that you come into contact with, during the school year. We've had a couple of high-profile mistakes made on the transfer rule in the last month or so. So I'm hoping that maybe by getting together and talking through a number of these things, we can make sure that everybody's on the same page, answer any questions you might have, and to move forward with it. Maybe to pick another topic sometime in the near future to be able to do with you as well. So again, here in our office, we work with the transfer rule and all the CIC rules all the time. And I know from being, in a public school for all those years, you don't have a lot of interaction with the transfer rule. So it's important to understand it when you do, that you have a good feeling for it and that you understand what you have to do. So, there's probably no topic when you go to national meetings. There's probably no topic other than how our divisions set up in your state talked about as to the transfer rule and the different versions of the transfer rule. Even in section 1 right here with our neighboring states, there's many different versions of the transfer rule. And we're going to talk a little bit about, obviously, Connecticut's. And that's, the first thing that parents are always going to ask you when they're involved with transfers is, why have a transfer rule? Why is it important to have it? And again, there's lots of reasons. And on the document I sent you, just some of the simple ones, to try to prevent recruiting of student athletes, really to try to prevent school jumping so that in education-based athletics, we don't have education decisions being made for athletic reasons. The kids are going to the school for the best educational experience, not necessarily the best athletic experience. Minimize the influence of athletics family decision regarding school attendance. But the last one's one that's not talked about a lot, but I always talk about it. And that is when you have students transferring back and forth to schools, they displace other student athletes who are already on a team. So all of a sudden you have 3 kids who decide to go from school A to school B, some senior or some junior who's been dying their whole life to start on a team. All of a sudden there's kids coming to their school, probably to play sports, and all of a sudden they're being displaced. Maybe they don't make the team or something else happens to them. So it's just important to have some way of regulating transfers, to regulate it, to make sure everybody understands that, transfers should be made for educational reasons, not athletic reasons. When I hit any of the different parts here, if you want to stop me and ask me a question, you're more than welcome to do it. No problem at all. So next part I put down there is just the history of the transfer rule. For some of you old timers, I'm not talking to you, Chip Salvas training. Some of you old timers, you've seen so many iterations of the transfer rule during our lives as athletic directors because the state is always seeking to try to find the fairest way to do something. Nothing is perfect. We all understand that. So for this current iteration of the transfer rule, it's been around for about 14 years. The previous transfer rule this particular rule was adopted in 2010. The transfer rule before this one called for student athletes to sit out 30 days of their season. So from the first contest date, you had to sit out 30 days. And the change in that rule came from CAD, and it went from 30 days to 50% of the season because many people felt that it was unfair to sports like cross country, who 30 days, put them into early October for many of them, and their season was coming close to being over. Where in football, it was basically just 3 weeks or so, 4 weeks of their season. They still had plenty of the season left. So this is it right here. And the next piece talks about the transfer rule itself. Okay, this is the setup of the transfer rule, that a student who transfers from an in-state school or out-of-state school to a CIC member school during grades 10, 11, or 12 without at the same time changing legal residence to another school district or school service area must complete at least 1 year, 365 days of approved membership before being eligible for interscholastic competition in the same sport in which he or she was a participant in the present or preceding season during grades 10, 11, or 12 on the junior varsity or varsity team. Legal residence is defined as location of the legal guardian. So for our purposes, when you talk about students, if you're living near the border of a state, you may have kids, especially if you're a private school, come to your school from out of state. The transfer rule applies to them if they're coming from a state association school. If they're coming from the New York State Association school, Massachusetts State Association school, the same transfer rule applies to them that it would apply to any state association member school in the state of Connecticut. If a student is coming from out of state from a non-state association school, then the transfer rule does not apply to them. But in general, you just have to think in terms of who does that transfer rule apply to. So that's what we're going to talk about next. Talk about who it applies to and how to apply it. If there's nothing else I say during this half hour to you that you listen to or you remember, it would be the next piece. And it's not about the rule itself at all. It's about you having a process within your building to identify transfer students. When kids come to your building, there needs to be some clear-cut process, you working with your guidance department to make sure you have all the information you need about transfers. In the summertime, you're going to get a large amount of student who transfer to your school. To have a list of all those students from your guidance department, where they came from, any information about them, perhaps a short form that each family fills out when they arrive in your school, just to tell you where they came from, how old the student is, what sports they played at their previous school, would give you a heads up for anything that might happen with that student athlete in the near future if they try out for a sport. Because quite honestly, when a student comes to your school in the fall, and they try out for a fall sport, you don't know these kids. You don't know who they are at this point. They're brand new to your building and you really don't have a good background in them. The other part here that's really important, and we talk about it all the time, is your best ally in all of this is definitely your coach. Your coach knows everything about the kids in town, who they are, who's coming to his or her team. And if you got a kid who's in 11th grade on the team and coach has never seen this kid before, it's probably something that needs to be brought to your attention. Where did you come from? Oh, I attended so-and-so school last year. My family moved here, whatever it might be. Your coach is be your best friend in that. And I'm telling you, oftentimes when we run into situations with transfers, coaches knew the kids were transfers, but never talked to the athletic director about it and never did anything with it. And then we run into a massive problem with that student athlete because that student athlete was or is a transfer, and it causes a lot of games to be forfeited and to ruin a season. Any questions on anything so far? Anything you want to ask about? Okay, in the new eligibility center, you can go to the eligibility center and the process is right there for you. You should not be putting any transfer information on the old eligibility center at this point. Everything is done in the new eligibility center. And when you go there and you look under forms and applications, you click on student transfer, add new, and the screen comes up in front of you to fill out all the information that you need on that student. But here again, you don't need to fill out a transfer form unless these three things down below are all true about that student. That portion that's written there is written at the top of the transfer form on the website. And I think sometimes when you guys go to the website, you just start to fill out the form without really reading what those three things are, because they clearly state this form is only required if all three of the following conditions apply. Everything there has to apply for you to fill out this form. One is the student athlete was in grade 10 or higher prior to withdrawing from their sending school. We have a get out of jail free card with 9th grade students in the state of Connecticut. A 9th grade basketball player can leave his or her school in January, transfer to another school, make that team, and play in the next game for their receiving school. There are no restrictions on 9th graders. They're allowed to move. And if they're in 10th grade and they come to your building during the summer, and they're entering 10th grade, logically the only time they could have, unless they repeated 9th grade, which is always a little scary, they couldn't have played in their 10th, 11th, or 12th grade year. So you don't have to worry about them. You don't have to fill out a transfer form them because they didn't play there. Even if a student goes to your school all throughout the fall season and then goes out for a winter sport as a 10th grader, it doesn't matter because the only time they could have played a sport would have been in 9th grade in their sending school. So that's all good, easy information for you to know. But once a kid plays a sport as a sophomore, junior, or senior, now those sports become an affected sport. That's the terminology we really need to get you guys to use. What is the affected sport? What's the sport that he played or she played as a sophomore, junior, or senior at the sending school? And once you've identified that, now you understand transfer rule is probably going to apply here. The second piece of it says the student athlete was a varsity or junior varsity player in grades 10, 11, or 12, and at least one CIAC sponsored sport during the calendar year, 365 days prior to the transfer. So if a kid transfers to your building, never played a sport at the school, if he's a junior, she's a senior, you don't have to fill out the transfer form. There's no penalty. If that kid all of a sudden decides to run cross country in his junior year and transferred here, but never ran cross country at the sending school, you have nothing to worry about. You don't need to fill out the form. It doesn't apply. And the last one is the most important one. The student athlete did not, while living with their parent or legal guardian, have a change of legal address into the service area of the receiving school. Meaning if they didn't change their address, in that particular case, and they simply went to a different school, they are subject to the transfer rule. And if all three of those things apply, then it's time to fill out the transfer form. Questions? Great.
Greg, I have a question. Sorry. I think a lot of times we've been filling out these forms under the assumption that we want to confirm that the information that's given to us is accurate. Are you telling us that we're supposed to just go off of what the parents are filling out and then not fill out a form if it meets these requirements?
You could always fill out the form. There's no problem with you filling out the form. There's a slight problem with filling out the form if you know the kid moved. Like, this is what happens to me all the time. I'll go through all the forms, I'll fill out the form, send it all back, and then I'll get an email from the school saying, well, why does he have to sit out? He moved with his mom. Well, you shouldn't have sent the form in. How am I supposed to know if he moved with his parent? I can't possibly know that. Or if a kid's a 9th grader, I don't really understand a lot of times why I get forms about 9th graders. And you understand the 9th grader has no transfer rule application to them at all. I think it's great. I think what we don't do enough, and I would have been totally guilty of this as an athletic director, when you hold your parent meetings at the beginning of the year or at the beginning of each season, you really should have 5 minutes on the transfer rule so that everybody in that audience in front of you is hearing that if you leave our school to go play somewhere else, you are, if these things apply, you are going to be subject to the transfer rule. Because it seems to me that even if parents, the parents are kind of shocked always that there is such a thing as the transfer rule. So even a poster, I think when I first got here, I made posters that you could hang up in guidance about the transfer rule so that the more it becomes part of the culture of parents to understand that if you transfer and these things apply, these three things apply to you, you are going to be subject to the transfer rule.
Good. Just in your answer to Matt's question, something came about in my head. I just want to ask a question about, so we say freshman, no transfer. When does that cutoff start in their sophomore year? If they're a wrestler, if they're a baseball player, outdoor track.
That's a great question, Chris.
Okay.
It really, everything in CIAC that we do begins, every eligibility rule begins when a student athlete participates in a game at any level. I can't tell you how many times I've had kids transfer over the summer, go through all the football lifting, football workouts, get to like game 1 week, and then miss their friends, miss what they were doing before, transfer back to their sending school, where they came from. They can play right away. Everything here happens once a kid participates. If you had a kid who you forgot to sit out for the transfer rule, and he or she was on the soccer team and didn't play in the first 2 games because they just didn't play, and then you're like, oh my God. My first question would be to you is, did they play in a game? And if they didn't play in a game, you have nothing to worry about. That's when everything begins. Every eligibility rule kicks in once a student athlete plays in a game. 8th semester rule, attendance rule, academic rules, everything starts at that moment. And it kind of makes
Oh,
sense, right? I mean, you
yeah,
participate
no,
in the game
it
with
it
us.
definitely makes sense. I guess if just want to make sure I'm good with it, right? Any spring sport, they transfer it to another school, no address change, right? They have to sit out their half of their season in their spring sport, but they can still play a fall sport at that new school. They can still play a winter sport. They just have to sit out half the season at that spring sport,
That's
correct?
correct. If they were right, if they once they hit their sophomore, junior, or senior year. And that's
Thank you.
hard. One of the worst ones I ever saw was a kid, a volleyball player who moved to a school district and played softball that year. She had never played softball at her previous school. So she played softball. The AD just didn't remember, that kid had to sit out volleyball the following year, and it was really bad. There was a lot of games that had to be forfeited. That's why I love that. For me, have that big cork board right above my desk here, and as an AD to remind me all the time of little things. Don't forget about, or when you can put it in information. Mary Jones needs to sit out, volleyball once we get to the fall. It's hard. Whatever process you can use to remember that, it's never easy. If you look at the bottom of that same filling out the transfer form, make sure to completely fill out the form. I'm getting a lot of these new forms that don't have birth dates on it, don't have a number of things on them. And it makes it a lot easier for me if I just have all the information so I can make a fair evaluation of the form. The form's initiated by the receiving school. So you got the kid in your building. All of a sudden you're like, well, these 3 things do apply, so I'm going to do that. Once it's filled out by the sending school, the form is sent to me and for the final determination of the transfer application. I literally, when I get it, I will turn it back over to you in 30 seconds. Once I have everything done, we've got the system down pat now where it's very easy to be able to turn things over very, very quickly to you. So I give a lot of credit to Fusion Point. You have a question, Matt?
Yeah, just going back to I know your response time once a transfer form is filled out is rather quick, but what if the sending school does not respond in a timely manner, and you're waiting on that information to be able to determine if a student athlete is eligible for a season?
I think it's really important that ADs communicate with each other. Way too often, people come to me and say, "Hey, they haven't filled out the form yet," and I'll ask, "Well, did you contact the school?" And they'll be like, "No." Well, it's so much easier. You guys all do the same job. You should all be trying to help each other. Kid already left. He's not coming back, right? And if somebody says to you, "Hey, I'm still waiting. It's been over a week. This kid's sitting out waiting," I think the vast majority of ADs would be like, "Oh, I'm sorry," and do that immediately. I think talking to the other school and trying to find out what's going on would be very, very helpful. But if you're asking me, I mean, technically by the rules, it says if it goes by the 14 days, the kid can be declared eligible. I've never enforced that in my entire life here. I think that's just wrong. I think, if there's a mistake that's been made, we need to rectify it, but we can't let a kid just not sit out because somebody didn't fill out a form. At the bottom, it says if both principals sign off that the transfer is not for athletic reasons, the student athlete will sit out 50% of the varsity schedule of the first affected sport. So again, had some mistakes with this recently. Here's where it comes up. It's easy when a kid moves during the summer, tries out for your soccer team, makes the soccer team, then you have them sit out 10 games to start your season. Easy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's harder when it's wrestling. It's harder when it's cross country. But really, all you have to do is just count up the total number of events. Just count the total number of events. So if it's an invitational, say in cross country, and you had 5 regular season league meets, and there's 4 invitationals, remember that person would have to sit out the first 5 combination of those 2. Same in wrestling, same in other sports that have something other than just the meets during the season. Questions? But what about if a kid comes to your school mid-season? The student athlete moves to your school, transfers to your school, I should say, in October. That same soccer kid, and you are now realize this kid is subject to the transfer rule. The form goes in, I fill it out, I send it back to you. 50% of the girls' soccer season You then have to go back to the beginning of the season. You don't start from the point the kid arrived and registered in your building. You go back to the beginning. The varsity schedule had 20 games. The kid sits out 10 games. So on October 7th, when the kid registered in your building and came to your building, he or she now needs to sit out the next 10 games, not the amount of games you have left. It's really critical that you understand that because I've seen mistakes made on that. Questions on that?
I think you actually confused me more than not on that one. So the clock starts when they get there. So if it's soccer, it's a 10-game season. The 10 game starts on October 7th, not September 1st.
He wasn't there, so yeah, couldn't start.
Right. Okay.
Well, what happens is sometimes people think it's half the games that are
Half the games remaining. I understand what you're saying.
once they arrive. And it's not. It's the total distance of your season. So again, I said 20, with soccer is 16. So it'd be 8 that they'd have to sit out.
So, Greg, if they got there and they set out 6 games to the end of the season, would they have to sit out the first 2 of the following year?
Unless they are a multi-sport athlete. If they're a multi-sport athlete, it carries over to the next affected sport. If they're not a multi-sport athlete, it carries over to the next year.
Thank
The
you.
other document I sent to you, just I should have brought it up right from the beginning, is my never-ending quest to have you guys have Appendix B on your desk and keep Appendix B near you. That's what I sent to you, because Appendix B really is a nice, tight compilation of our eligibility rules. And you can kind of read the different situations there. And if you need to interpret them for any other reason, just give us a call. But it's right there for you for most things. Explains the sit out time and everything else. Other questions? Like all things, there are exceptions to the transfer rule. There are 18 different exceptions to that rule. Okay, some of them are kind of one-offs. They're, not going to happen very often. Like if a school closes, students who transfer from that school are eligible to be able to participate in sports at the new school right away. Doesn't happen very often. If a school gets rid of an athletic program, says we're not going to have ice hockey anymore, we're not going to have football anymore, then those kids can transfer in that sport and not be held to the transfer rule in that sport at the new school. There's ones in here about foreign exchange students, about kids who go overseas, about kids who join the army. There's a whole bunch of things, right? That probably somewhere during the history of this organization, there was a need to put that exception in for that case. But what I listed here for you are ones that surprise people sometimes when they don't know the exceptions to the transfer rule. So I kind of went through it in preparation for this, say these are the ones we see the most. So be aware of it. Number 1 talks about the fact that if you get a kid who comes from a non-CIAC school to your school, as long as they were in the other school for 90 calendar days prior to coming to your school, they're not subject to the transfer rule. So the kid comes to you from Choate, from Hamden Hall, as starting their junior year, and they were at the school their whole junior or their sophomore year, and now he wants to transfer or she wants to transfer. Those kids are not subject to the transfer rule. Don't even have to think about it. Don't even fill out a form. Sometimes I get the call like, hey, I'm looking on the column here and I can't find Choate, for the sending school. Well, there's a reason for that. It's because of the number 1 exception.
Greg, how about homeschool kids?
Again, homeschool kids is a very interesting topic, and that homeschool kids are not permitted to participate in athletics in Connecticut.
But once they come to the school, are they automatically ready to play?
Again, a homeschool kid, it depends on if your school accepts the credits for that homeschool kid. If your school, which is rare, but if your school accepts the credits, say their 9th grade year, they sit out and this is kind of a different topic because it's not necessarily a transfer, but they sit out, and when he or she comes to school, the school accepts 5 credits from their freshman year. Well, then you can allow them to play at least by academic standards. It's really up to the school. Very, very few public schools allow students who've taken online courses to use those courses as part of their requirements at their school. Very few. Private schools sometimes do. Number 7, if you have 2 high schools in your town, okay? If the superintendent of schools orders a student to be moved from one high school to the other high school, bullying, whatever was going on, no questions from this office here, that student is immediately eligible. So again, if you have more than one high school in your town, and I'm looking at some of you and you do, most of you have had this happen already in your time there. Okay? Number 8 is a very common one, and that is if you have a student who is moving between parents, they're going from one school system to another school system with parents, right? We are going to give you one time every 365 days that student can move between parents who both have guardianship. To be quite honest with you, the way the exception is written, long before I got here, it was elaborated to allow that. The reality of the exception is it was meant for a student's family who goes through a divorce and then they move to separate residence and the student goes to a different residence. He or she was not like punished because of that. They could play immediately. But this office over a long period of time kind of evolved into allowing kids between parents for a lot of good reasons, to be able to move that one time and play automatically. You'll definitely see that. 9 always surprises people. You can have a student who's 18 years or older move out of their household, move in with a family friend, grandma, uncle, whatever it might be. And if the school accepts them in their residency in that home, they can play immediately. We have a very high profile basketball player down in Fairfield County who moved out of his house, moved in with a really good friend of his on his AAU team, and then played for that high school his senior year because he's 18. So that's one of the reasons why I ask you all the time when a senior transfers, my first question to everyone always is he or she 18? Because it makes a big difference. Number 13 there is a special needs student. This happens rarely. This is not happening a lot, but it does happen, especially if a kid goes from a private school to a public school. If that school says we could not provide the special education needs for this student who's got an IEP or has a 504 plan, we will allow that student to transfer without being penalized by the transfer rule. So you just, again, I'm being honest with you here, just from my experience, most public schools are not going to say we couldn't provide services for a 504 or a student with an IEP. Sometimes private schools, which maybe don't have those depth of resources, will say it's better for him or her to go to the public school because we can't provide the necessary resources. It's I think very professional on their part that they do so. 15 is an odd one, but it comes up every single year, so you should know it. And that is when a student comes to your building and he or she is not in their, let's just do it easy way. A student moves, okay, during the summer, and he or she continues to go to the school in a different town that they went to. Maybe it's a private school, right? And then mid-year, they say, oh, no, I want to transfer and go to this school. And you say the transfer and the move have to happen at the same moment. You can't have a kid move during the summer and then all of a sudden in December or January say, hey, I moved. I shouldn't be subject to the transfer rule. I'm going to go over here to this new school. Doesn't work that way. The two have to happen at the same moment, or at least within the summer, or I've let it go with it when it's like a week or two. It's not a big deal because we're still in practices. 17 says a student whose parents move out of the district anytime after he or she becomes a grade 10 student may continue to be eligible in the same school provided enrollment is continuous, unbroken in the same school. This happens lots of times with seniors. When seniors leave, their parents move to Florida because they have a great opportunity and they want to leave their child in the custody of somebody here in Connecticut. They are allowed to do so as long as the chain is unbroken, the meaning they didn't disenroll for 4 months and then say, I really want to go back to my original high school. That can't work that way. But if you leave, you're allowed to do that. An 18,
Greg.
of course, yeah.
Sorry. Every once in a while, we get a McKinney-Vento kid. How
Yeah.
does that work?
Well, the McKinney-Vento, you really need to call us on.
Okay.
Have us get involved with you so we understand, the depth of it with you. Because again, a McKinney-Vento kid should be a kid who is homeless.
Right.
Right. So you have to kind of establish whether they're homeless or do they just move in with a relative because, whatever, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Let us
yeah.
work with you on those McKinney-Vento because that becomes very problematic if you don't, if we don't see exactly, what's going on in that particular family. Most of
Okay.
the time, those kids are eligible to participate.
Okay. Thank you.
And 18 is the one that everybody uses when they appeal. They call for hardship. And hardship is kind of like if you're a Constitution person, it's kind of like the elastic clause in the Constitution. It covers a wide variety of what that hardship might be. And a kid goes and says they have a hardship, it lists a number of different examples of hardships. And oftentimes when student athletes appeal their eligibility or appeal the transfer rule, they will go to hardship as the reason why they are appealing it. Now that's a lot of information for you, and I apologize for giving you so much, but those are the things that happen most of the time up here. I just want to make sure you understand that when you're filling out the transfer form, please focus on those 3 things that are at the top of the form. Make sure all 3 of those are true about a kid to see whether or not the transfer rule is going to apply to them. The last piece I have for you there is nothing in CIAC rules that talks about residency. School districts apply residency. You determine if a student is a resident in your district. A lot of you have, bring in a bill, bring in this, bring in that, all those other things residency-wise. Residency only appears in our rules when it applies to a student athlete. And when a student athlete is looking at residency, it's where their parent or guardian reside. We go through this 15 times a year. When a student athlete moves in with grandma, moves in with uncle, moves in with somebody else who does not have legal guardianship over them. Legal guardianship in our rules says that a probate judge needs to sign the document stating that you now have legal guardianship over this minor. I've seen it 8 times since I've been here, seen the actual document. Many people will write a letter to us, I'm giving guardianship, or have some form they're using. None of that works. And I hope you all understand that, if we allowed people to move in with aunts, uncles, people like that, we might as well not have a transfer rule. I mean, you're just going to move in with whomever you want living in a town to be able to play somewhere different. But again, all of these things, everything within the transfer rule is meant to try in some way of keeping things in a fair, plane for all of our member schools, as far as being able to accept kids from other districts without there being what I think is a small penalty for a 2 or 3 sport athlete moving in their junior year to have to sit out half of the first affected sports season. You can still scrimmage, you can still practice, you can still play for the team, is a reasonable expectation. Okay, questions from you? I'm at 36 minutes. We started a couple minutes late.
In the transfer document, there's a thing in there for click this if we believe it's an the transfer is athletic purposes. It happens to everybody at some point. What are the things that the CIAC would look at and say, yes, we agree. This kid went from X school to Y school to play this sport.
I think I remember it's in the document. If you look at Appendix B, it talks about a bottom of page 218. It talks about a transfer for athletic reasons is defined as, but not limited to. And it gives you a lot of examples of what a principal might choose to do if he or she decides not to sign the transfer form. Probably twice a year. This happens, and then we need proof. We need some burden of proof is on the sending school who says the kid left our school for athletic reasons. Just a little one that comes up every now and then. So let's say a student athlete plays 3 sports, transfers, no legal change of address, comes to your school, and then decides, oh, you know what? I'm not going to play soccer in the fall. And on the form I send to you, it says they sit out 50% of the soccer season. But they say, no, I'm just going to focus on basketball this year, and basketball is the next affected sport. So that student athlete, even though it says in the form I sent to you, soccer, they got to sit out some affected sport. So that next affected sport would be basketball, and they would have to sit out half the basketball season if that's the case. You can't just or not try out for a team. We've had this question this year already. What if I go to the school and I'll just sit out, X sport in the fall, but I won't try out for the team. I won't play for the team, but I did play it as a sport at the sending school. We rely on our member schools and on their honesty and on their integrity to say, well, that's not right. That doesn't work. So you're not going to be able to do so. Okay, I'm getting a bunch of questions here. So I'm sorry, Amy, I didn't see this one from 1018. So she couldn't play softball or volleyball. I thought she would only have to sit out the sport she'd previously played. Right. So in that case, I gave you softball was not a sport she had previously played. She just decided to try to play it there. Volleyball was the affected sport. So that kid needed to sit out volleyball, but nobody remembered as we came around all the way back around to the fall that she still hadn't sat out. Do we have access to the other exceptions? Yeah, they're all in Appendix B. So that's why I'm praying that you guys will take some time to sit and look over Appendix B. All the other exceptions are located in there. I'm wondering if you could share any document for reference due to the importance of So Soraya, if somebody at your school could get you the documents I sent out today, that would be awesome. And Amy, so for a student that transferred to live with grandparents, what? Oh, to her mother going to jail. They don't have legal guardianship though. When would she be eligible to play a sport? It's 365 days. Again, any of these things can be appealed to the eligibility committee. Any of these things can be appealed. We're dealing with that situation, a very similar situation right now. With that very similar situation where a mother is out of the picture now, grandmother's taking care of the child. We're trying to work our way through that. Lauren, I missed the part. The form is filled out by sending or receiving school. It started by the receiving school because you're the ones who get the student. The kid now left sending school A, goes to the receiving school, and he or she now is in your building. So you need to start the form. Right, 365 days from day of enrollment. That is correct. When you're talking to parents and they're really upset, one of the things we always suggest that you do is just to say, the CIAC rule is 365 days because both parents or both principals signed off on it to say it wasn't for athletic reasons. It shrinks down to the first half of the first affected season. Other questions? Anything you're not sure of?
Greg, from a CIC Board of Control perspective, could you give us a couple examples that could probably help us? As you mentioned, the majority of appeals are under the hardship category that are filed by schools on behalf of families and students from a CIC Board of Control perspective, it would just help us because those can be timely processes in terms of documentation, going to a second appeal in person. If we've been through those,
Yep.
of,
I would say,
for unforeseen, unavoidable, and unusual circumstance. Could you just time and, also CIAC's time?
so for the transfer rule, in this case, which we're talking about in the transfer rule, again, a principal would seek to appeal the transfer rule using the hardship, unless it's one of the exceptions. If you have an exception in your back pocket and it's accurate, it's 100% guaranteed that the appeal will be granted. That's 100%. But if you're going to use the hardship, there has to be a demonstrable hardship. So if a student says, I left the private school that I was attending because the private school was just too expensive, I just didn't realize it. Most of the time, the eligibility committee is not going to accept that. They're going to say, you sent your kid to a private school, you knew how expensive it was all on the up and up, and you chose to stay there for 2 years at least, because otherwise you could have just transferred. That's not hardship. But when kids leave private schools to go back to public schools, and these are the things I've seen: foreclose their home. One of the two parents lost a job. Their business went bankrupt. There are really a major change in how they had, they're in their financial state. Those are guaranteed to be approved by the eligibility committee or by the eligibility review board. Guaranteed. That's a clear hardship. Hardship in many of these cases might be a kid who's homeless, or have kids who have really bad things that have happened to them. But if the transfer rule, remember, almost 100% of the time, the transfer rule is between a private school and a public school, one way or the other. They go one way or the other. So, a lot of times when it's from a public school to a private school, it's financial is by, no question, is the number one reason they give. I've got Gina. This year, it appears some transfers are still on the old eligibility system. Will they moved out to the new one so they all appear in one place? That's a great question, Gina, because I was just on the old system this morning doing some transfers over there. I'm not sure that we have the ability to still move all of those transfers over, but I definitely will ask Fusion Point if they're pretty much done moving stuff over as far as transfer requests. But if we could all just make sure we're doing it on the CIAC, the new CIAC website, that would be very helpful. Like I said, I can turn things over very, very quickly there, and I promise you that I will, as long as I have both schools done. Any other questions?
Greg, if I don't get a transfer form and one of my student athletes goes to another high school now, but the other high school has him down as he moved and he met all the criteria, but we know that there's no transfer form for me to fill out or dispute. What steps should I be taking when these situations happen?
Any member school can challenge another member school on, failing to abide by rules of eligibility. So if your principal wrote a letter to me saying, Johnny Jones moved and all the information about it, he still lives at, then we launch, as long as we'll always give the other school a chance to respond. And when the other school responds, it's up to us to decide with the Board of Control whether to launch an investigation. We probably do 5 or 6 investigations a year into claims made by one school against another. So that would be your recourse.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Anything else you want to talk about as far as transfer rule goes? All right. I'm sorry I went a little bit longer than I thought. Hopefully it was beneficial to you to hear it all. If something pops in your head later today and you want to write me a quick email, feel free to do so. I'll try to answer anything I can. But again, thanks for taking the time out of your day to come on here. Thanks.